The Humvee lurched to a violent stop, throwing everyone inside against their heavy nylon seatbelts. The distinctive ear-splitting crack of an rocket-propelled grenade, RPG, impact echoed off the walls of the narrow Afghan canyon, followed immediately by the staccato roar of automatic weapons fire. For the men of the joint American-Afghan convoy, the ambush they had always trained for had just become a terrifying reality. Inside the chaos of the third vehicle, Senior Chief Mark Donald, a Navy SEAL and the team's combat medic, felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. The years of training, the mock drills, the academic study of medicine, it all evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal instinct to survive and, more importantly, to save. This was October 25, 2003, in the desolate, rugged terrain of Paktika Province, Afghanistan. The mission was a routine presence patrol, a show of force meant to partner American special operators with their Afghan allies. But al-Qaeda fighters, hidden in the high ground of the canyon, had other plans. The first RPG slammed into the canyon wall, a warning shot that sent shrapnel pinging against the vehicles. The second was a direct hit on the lead Humvee. As dust and smoke billowed into the air, obscuring the sun, Donald didn't hesitate. He kicked his door open, the metal groaning under the force. The air was thick with the smell of burnt explosives and cordite. He could hear the desperate cries of men over the unending crackle of gunfire. His vehicle's driver was slumped over the wheel, a jagged piece of shrapnel protruding from his shoulder, his foot still jammed on the brake. Blood, a shocking, vibrant red against the dust, was pumping from the wound, soaking the man's uniform. With adrenaline flooding his system, Donald was a blur of motion. He grabbed the driver, ignoring the searing heat of the vehicle's hood, and dragged him from the cab, pulling him behind the engine block, the only scant cover available. Laying the man flat, Donald's hands moved with a speed born of countless hours of practice. He ripped open the driver's uniform to assess the damage, an arterial bleed. This was a life-or-death minute. He packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, the white fabric instantly turning crimson. He applied direct pressure, his muscles straining, while simultaneously scanning the kill zone for other casualties. And he saw the Afghan commander, dazed and wounded, stumbling in the open. Still applying pressure with one hand, Donald reached out with his other and yanked the commander behind the vehicle, shielding him from the incoming fire that chewed up the ground where he had just been standing. Donald knew the driver wouldn't survive another severe bleed. He had to improvise. Using his own body as a shield, he knelt over the man. He's exposing his own back to the enemy fire that snapped and cracked past his head. In that moment, the mission, his own safety, everything faded except for the one task: keeping this man's blood inside his body. He worked frantically, his voice calm and steady as he spoke to the wounded man, telling him he was going to make it, ordering him to stay with him. It was a stark juxtaposition of violence and tenderness, a healer at work in the very heart of destruction. But even as he fought for one life, others were slipping away. He saw Chief William Bill Carlson and Christopher Glenn Muller. They had taken the brunt of the initial blast. Donald's heart sank as he made his way to them, the medic's grim assessment already formed before he touched their still bodies. They were gone. There was nothing he could do. The reality of combat medicine is brutal triage. You cannot save everyone. You have to focus on those you can. The weight of that knowledge, and of leaving fallen brothers behind, settled on his soul like a stone, but he couldn't stop. He pushed the grief down, deep into a dark place, to be dealt with later. Later, if there was a later. The canyon rang with the sound of battle. The air was a deadly swarm of lead and steel. Donald, now wounded himself by shrapnel that had torn into his leg and back, felt the warm trickle of his own blood mixing with that of his patients. He ignored it. Pain was just data. but he moved from one vehicle to the next, finding more wounded, Afghan soldiers who had been hit in the initial fusillade. Some of the able-bodied men were yelling at him to take cover in a nearby irrigation ditch, a safer position. Donald looked at them, then at the wounded. "It was either leave the men or stay and die," he would later write. The choice was no choice at all. He stayed. For what felt like an eternity, Donald operated in a bubble of intense concentration. He stuffed wounds. I'd applied tourniquets and cleared airways. He worked methodically, his hands slick with blood. When the immediate casualties were stabilized, his role shifted. He was no longer just a medic. He was a SEAL. Taking charge of a squad of dazed Afghan soldiers, he organized a counterattack, rallying them to return fire and push the enemy back from their dominant position. He led them forward, firing his rifle, directing their fire, and coordinating with the limited radio communications he had. Then he was fighting the enemy while simultaneously preparing his patients for medical evacuation, medevac, mentally cataloging who needed to be lifted out first. Then, a new piece of information crackled over the radio. Another unit, just 200 meters away, was also under heavy attack and had taken casualties. 200 meters. In a combat zone under heavy fire, that might as well be 200 miles. But to a SEAL, it was a distance that had to be covered. Donald didn't think. He just moved. But he sprinted across the exposed terrain, his wounded legs screaming in protest as enemy machine guns and small arms fire kicked up dirt at his heels. He was a lone figure, a man in a rumpled uniform, running toward the sound of the guns, toward the wounded. He reached the other ambush site, finding another American and another Afghan soldier gravely wounded. He immediately began treatment, once again shielding them with his own body. Army AH-64. Apache helicopters were now circling overhead, ready to unleash devastating fire, but Donald, focused on his patients, coordinated their movement, leading the walking wounded back through the hail of fire to the relative safety of the main convoy. By the time the fighting died down, Donald had been on his feet, treating and fighting for hours. He had saved multiple lives, organized a counter-assault, and ran through a buzzsaw of enemy fire to reach more wounded. Only when every other man had been treated and the medevac birds were inbound did he finally allow himself to sit down and tend to his own shrapnel wounds. He was the last line of defense between life and death, and he had held. For his actions that day, Mark Donald would later receive the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States Navy, a testament to his extraordinary heroism. But because of the classified nature of the mission, his name was initially redacted. For 2 years, he was an anonymous hero, the story of his valor a classified secret. He wore the medal, but he could not speak of it. He carried the weight of that day, the memory of the men he saved, and the searing, indelible image of the two he could not, Carlson and Muller, in silence. The story, however, does not end on that Afghan battlefield. The true battle, the one that tested him to his very core, began when he came home. Mark Donald returned from war a decorated hero, but he was also a wounded man. Not just from the shrapnel, but from wounds invisible to the eye. The silence he was forced to keep about his actions was a cage that held the traumatic memories, the guilt, the grief, and the horror. They festered inside him, eating away at his peace of mind. He had post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that for a long time he refused to acknowledge. Years later, long after he had retired from the Navy as one of the most decorated Medical Service Corps officers in its history, Donald found himself in a hotel conference room. It was a gathering of veterans, a place of shared experience and understanding. The room was filled with men and women who, like him, wore the invisible scars of service. They talked of their struggles, their demons, their long roads home. For a long time, Donald sat silent, listening. He was a man who had built a career on stoicism. on projecting strength, on being the unflappable one in the chaos. To admit weakness felt impossible. But as he listened to story after story of pain and survival, something shifted. He saw his own reflection in their eyes. He realized that the strength he had shown on the battlefield was not the opposite of vulnerability. It was the foundation for it. It took more courage to speak than it had to run through that canyon. Finally, a young veteran finished his story, and the room fell into a reflective, heavy silence. It was in that quiet that Mark Donald, the man who had faced down an Al-Qaeda ambush without flinching, finally stood up. The room, filled with warriors, turned their attention to the man now on his feet. He was older now, his hair grayer, but his bearing still spoke of a lifetime of discipline. He began to speak. He started with the facts of that day in October 2003. The ambush, the chaos, the blood. He spoke of the driver he saved, the commander he shielded. But then, his voice, which had been steady and clinical, began to waver. He spoke of Bill Carlson and Chris Muller. He spoke of the moment he knew they were gone. He spoke of the guilt he had carried for 2 decades, the survivor's guilt that whispered he should have done more, been faster, tried harder. He spoke of coming home and locking that day in a steel box inside his mind, and how that box had slowly poisoned everything, his relationships, his happiness, or his peace. As he spoke, the room became utterly still. These were men and women who understood combat, who understood loss. But they were hearing something more than a battle narrative. They were witnessing an exorcism. They were watching a man confront his deepest, darkest wounds in real time, in front of them, his brothers and sisters. They saw the pain etched on his face, the way his hands trembled slightly, the faraway look in his eyes that signaled he was no longer in a hotel conference room, but back in that dusty, blood-soaked canyon. He spoke of the years of silent struggle, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the slow, agonizing disintegration of his spirit. He spoke of the moment he finally hit bottom and realized that the silence that had protected his nation's secrets was now destroying his soul. He had to break his silence to save himself. When he finished, there was no sound. And you could have heard a pin drop. The weight of his confession, of his pain laid bare for all to see, hung in the air. The room was quiet, not with the awkward silence that follows a poorly told joke, but with the profound, reverent hush that follows something sacred. It was the quiet of shared humanity, of understanding, of profound respect. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, then another and another. Soon the entire room was on its feet. A standing ovation not for the warrior who had won the Navy Cross, but for the man who had finally found the courage to be wounded and wordless no more. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death twice, once in Afghanistan and once in that hotel room. And he had emerged, finally, truly, battle-ready for the peace he so richly deserved. The silence that followed his story was not an end, but a beginning, a testament that sometimes the most powerful thing a warrior can do is lay down his arms and simply speak the truth.